Speedy Balloon is definitely a lesser known Clash Royale deck, and even people who do know it often consider it a meme deck that isn't actually viable. However, if you know what you're doing, this deck can actually be really strong, and that is why in this video I put together everything you need to know to successfully play Speedy Balloon. First, we're gonna have a look at different decks you can play with Speedy Balloon, the right placements for the Speedy Balloon, what playstyle works best, some different tactics to use, and at the end, we'll have a look at some matchups. There are a lot of variations you can play Speedy Balloon in. If you already have the deck you want to play, you can skip to the time on screen. If you haven't, I'm now going to walk you through all the different possibilities you have when playing Speedy Balloon. First, let's get the two obvious ones out of the way, the Skeleton Barrel and the Balloon. Now, I will show you different options for every deck slot. Which one you choose should depend on your levels, what cards you usually face, and obviously also just preference. First, I would choose either the Ashes if you need some more damage, or the Firecracker if you need splash. I would also recommend using these as your evolution if you can. As your spell, you should either use Snowball or Rage. This is just about preference. I personally prefer Rage for the extra speed though. Your building can be either the Inferno Tower, Tesla, or the Bomb Tower. Again, depending on whether you still need damage, splash, or just a good all-rounder. Now, for your mini tank, you can use pretty much every option, but I would recommend using either the Knight or the Mighty Miner if you want to play a champion. For your cycle card, I heavily recommend Skeletons, but you can also use any other 1 elixir card. Now, there's one slot left in your deck, and I would recommend playing Royal Delivery. However, if you want to get a bit creative, this slot is definitely the one to do so. So, now that we have our deck, we can get straight to the next point. Most people will just place the Skeleton Barrel at the bridge and then pull the balloon over to the exact same tile so that it gets deployed in front of the Skeleton Barrel. And technically, there's nothing wrong about this approach. You should always place the Skeleton Barrel before the balloon, so that they both get deployed right at the bridge, with the balloon in front of the Skeleton Barrel. However, by just pulling the balloon to the same tile as the Skeleton Barrel, due to the minimal time between deploying the Skeleton Barrel and it starting to move, there's a very high likelihood that you'll sometimes end up placing the balloon behind the Skeleton Barrel, or try too fast and place it one tile off. To prevent that, you should do the following. Drag the Skeleton Barrel to the bridge with one hand, but don't place it yet. With your other hand, select the balloon in your cards bar. Now, let go of the screen and immediately tap it again at the exact same point to deploy the already selected balloon directly on top of it. That way, with a bit of practice, you can get it 100% of the time. The bridge isn't the only point where you can place your Speedy Balloon. If your opponent is playing a building, you can place the Speedy Balloon on one of the outer tiles to get around it. Also, by delaying your balloon a bit, the Skeleton Barrel will push the balloon even further to the side, away from your opponent's building. However, you obviously also lose some speed by placing it to the side. If you want to attack a King Tower, you can do it with the placements on screen. Just use both hands to bring the cards into position and release them at the same time. If you've already took both of your opponent's towers, you can also place the Speedy Balloon right in front of the King Tower. By the way, if you only have your Skeleton Barrel in cycle and the balloon is your next card, you can place the Skeleton Barrel 2 tiles away from the bridge and then place the balloon in front of it as soon as you can. Speedy Balloon is generally speaking more of a defensive deck. However, as some of you might have already seen, it also doesn't really have great counter push possibilities. So, what you want to do is try and get positive elixir traits on defense and use that advantage to place as many Speedy Balloons as possible. You shouldn't play too defensive neither though, because especially if you go Speedy Balloon first play, but also at any other point in the game, your opponent will often panic when they see it, and either overcommit onto it or misplace a building, so definitely don't underestimate the offensive power of the deck. Also, if possible, you should always go in on the other lane than your opponent, to prevent them from building a big counter push. So, to summarize the most important points, don't try and build counter pushes, play defensive to get a slight elixir advantage. When possible, try and take the tower on the other lane than your opponent to prevent counter pushing, and don't hesitate playing your Speedy Balloon quite often, because it allows you to apply lots of pressure on your opponent, and often won't even give your opponent a positive trait, unless they eat a lot of damage. Before we can get to the next point, I want to talk about the major weaknesses that the deck has. First of all, due to most variants only having one small spell, the deck has pretty much no spell cycling potential. For that reason, you should try and put constant pressure on your opponent, especially during free X elixir time. Also, as mentioned earlier, you don't really have any counter push potential, because none of the troops in the deck have great attacking synergy with Speedy Balloon. So now, with that part out of the way, let's get straight to the next point. The first tactic that is really important to know for this deck is tower trading. For example, if your opponent has already dealt a lot of damage to one of your towers, but you haven't, and now he builds another big push in the same lane, instead of spending all your elixir to defend and maybe keep that tower, just play a Speedy Balloon, preferably in the outer lane, and only defend your opponent as much as needed to not get free ground. That way, instead of still being down a lot of damage, you are now back in the game. Keep in mind that you should only do that if you know for sure that your opponent can't defend, because otherwise you might find yourself down an entire tower in the end. The reason why this is so important for Speedy Balloon is again the low counter push potential, due to which defending a big push doesn't do as much as with other decks, so tower trading is a good alternative. Next, let's have a look at some more ways to play around your opponent's building. First, you can try and bait your opponent's building by playing the Skeleton Barrel first. However, this only works when your opponent doesn't have a small spell to just get rid of it. Or, you could play the Skeleton Barrel and the Balloon on either side of the map on the spots on screen. That way, whichever building your opponent is using, they won't be able to pull both. And if they try, by playing their building in the middle, they'll just miss both. And even if they pull your balloon, you'll still get the chip damage from the Skeleton Barrel. Now, we'll talk about matchups. However, talking about every archetype in particular would take forever and probably be very repetitive and boring. So, I'll just talk about some more general stuff. Generally speaking, buildings are the biggest counter to Speedy Balloon. So when your opponent doesn't have a building, that means that you will have a lot easier time winning. Also, in that case, you can eat quite a bit of damage, because you can always tower trade or just spam Speedy Balloon, so when your opponent doesn't have a building, play quite aggressive. Now, if they have one, you definitely have to play more defensive and take every opportunity to deal consistent damage. Another really good counter is the rocket, but if you play Rage, you can try and dodge it by speeding up your Speedy Balloon, and often they won't adjust and place the rocket too far back, missing the balloon. So those are the three main scenarios: no building, building, and rocket. Though, there are obviously a lot more cards that are good against Speedy Balloon. And there are also decks that run two buildings or tornado building, which makes breaking through nearly impossible. So, what can we conclude? Due to the Speedy Balloon being the heart of the deck, most matchups are determined by how good your opponent can defend it. And the better they can, the more defensive you should play, to not fall back in damage too much. Because there's a very low likelihood that you'll get it back. By the way, that is also the reason why Speedy Balloon first play isn't a terrible play. Even though you might get punished for it sometimes, because in terrible matchups, this might be the only way for you to take their tower, if they don't have the right cards in their starting hand. But in the end, you have to decide whether or not to take that risk. Alright, that's it. Hope you enjoyed the video. Peace.